Are my expectations of what I want to do in my day-to-day and what do I achieve, are they realistic? Could I carve that? Could I be a pioneer where I don't see examples? How much can I control and change? How much can I influence where I'm working to adapt to what I'm trying to control and change? And where is there just a kind of force greater than all that, where maybe I need to make my own adaptations?
Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and today we are revisiting a previous episode with my guest, Jen Thompson. Jen is the Chief Brand Officer at Japonesque, which is a beauty and wellness company with a portfolio of brands that's disrupting the industry with new technology and by creating new categories. Jen has had a super successful career as a brand builder at various companies, including Procter & Gamble, where we worked together and became close friends. Now, I wanted to revisit this episode for a couple of reasons. Sometimes I feel like the universe surrounds me with a bunch of people who have the same Enneagram type, and it helps me kind of connect some dots about people and how they show up. And honestly, one of the things that the Enneagram can be great at, it helps me fall in love with humanity just a little bit more. Right now, as I'm recording this, I feel like I'm surrounded by Enneagram type 6s, which is Jen's type, and we get into that and what it has meant for her during this episode. Now, I also think her story and how she's able to articulate it is such a great example of the nuance of navigating authenticity at work, which really is what this podcast is all about. Sometimes our careers require us to adapt or grow ourselves in a way that feels stretching or uncomfortable. And sometimes we can see how an environment or a boss is asking us to conform to ways of being that aren't true to us, or our work is no longer aligned with our values. And this is exactly why the topic of authenticity is complex. We all go on a journey of sorting out what works for us as an individual, dynamic, and complex human. I hope you enjoy this conversation as we dive into how Jen learned to advocate for herself in her career, communicate both effectively and authentically, and how her career ambitions shifted as she embarked on new life stages of marriage and parenting. Without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome, Jen, to Working Your Way. I'm really excited to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you are the Chief Brand Officer of Japonesque, and that is a role not only with a huge scope, it's very impressive, and I'm obviously very proud of you as a friend to getting to this amazing place. And I want to talk more about how you're showing up as a leader, but let's talk a little bit about some of the earlier parts of your career and like how you got here. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what were some of the times in your career where you didn't feel like you could show up fully as yourself.
I identified for the first decade of my career as a careerist, where that was the priority above all else. I put in long hours happily, pre-kids, pre-getting married. I had the time to invest in that careerist mentality. And I loved what I did, and I loved the achievements that I had garnered in the time of that first decade of my career. And then I did get married and I started a family, and I still had a tremendous amount of career ambition, but I was having this kind of unarticulated tension of wanting these things in my career and wanting these things in my personal life, and struggling a little bit with what was my authentic way of now juggling these two worlds. And what I specifically juggled with was still being very ambitious, but feeling less comfortable doing the things that a careerist might do to achieve career advancement. I was no longer as willing to work, weekends and nights just to be my best human, my best, partner, mother to my children, even friends, as I was now juggling this, extra element in the time that I had to spend with people. I felt that I was trying to reconcile authentic behaviors in completely different contexts instead of having a definition of my one authentic self. I am someone who is ambitious but puts family first was effectively how I landed on what I redefined authenticity to be for me.
How would you define a careerist, and where do you think that ambition came from?
I think a careerist, as I kind of self-describe myself, is someone who has a little bit of extra self-worth placed within what they do for a living instead of who they are. I took a lot of pride on being able to introduce myself not as Jen with these hobbies, but Jen is this person who worked at a Fortune 50 company and had all this responsibility. And I think where it came from was a little bit of my background. I had a very hardworking entrepreneurial set of parents. They had their own small business. And as small business owners, they had to invest a lot of time in work fundamentally. They were always there for us as kids. I'm one of 3 sisters. They came to all our sporting events. They helped us with our science fair projects, but they integrated that into their small business life. So to me, it was very normal to have work be such a large part of your waking day. And then seeing the challenges my parents had running a small business, I wanted the steady paycheck. I think it's admirable what entrepreneurs do. I don't know that I'm as bold to take on all the challenges, right? I grew up knowing exactly what that would entail. And so I kind of wanted to work with something that had a little bit of momentum for it and then apply my little entrepreneurial spirit within it. So from a careerist standpoint, it's that, your waking day is largely consumed with what you're doing for work, partly because it consumes a lot of your day and hopefully you enjoy it. It becomes a little bit of what's in your purpose in your day to day. I was not motivated by pay or status. It was really much more achievement that, I had the grit and I had the hard work, and my signal of that paying off for me and being worth it was that, I move up and up and up and my responsibility increases. I don't think being a careerist is necessarily a bad thing. I think everything that makes you authentic is just your set of choices. But I think a little bit because of what I grew up seeing, work was just kind of at a bit of an epicenter in terms of where I focused on, what do I want my work to be? What do I want my waking day ambition to focus on from a working perspective? And then it just kind of snowballed from there, really.
Many people can kind of pick up these messages along the way, right? As we are in our childhood and progress throughout college and our careers and kind of take those things with us, right? So you saw a really hardworking set of parents and you saw difficulty in, building a lifestyle when you're running a small business. So taking that message, okay, hard work. And then, okay, I'm going to add some stability into the bag with a Fortune 50 company. But I know you to be someone who, even at pretty young ages, was quite intentional about things. And so I'm wondering, as you started your career and really put a lot of importance, having it play an important role in your life, which, like you said, is not a bad thing. How much of that was intentional versus this is the message that I got and I'm taking it and running with it?
It was very intentional. I had kind of found my industry niche and then set the intention of, well, if I'm going to go into this industry, I want the broadest opportunities available to me for wherever I get my first job. So I was very focused on this, Fortune 100 for the training, for the, reputation, more to unlock doors. It wasn't like a bragging right piece. It was almost like criteria of if I want the opportunities to be available to me in 10 years that maybe I want, a high ranking executive in a CPG firm, I should go to one of the companies that I keep seeing over and over again as part of these executives' history. So I did a lot of research. So I was pretty methodical with the planning. And even in the context of what I said, triggered a bit of a reassessment of authenticity, having a family. I have 3 children. Intellectually, I knew that was going to happen. I think for all the planning that you do for the college mapping and the job interviews and the roles that you try to plot once you're in a company, the thing that's less easy to anticipate is how you'll feel in the moment when you're in those seats, when you have those accomplishments, when you have those life changes. And so for all of my planning, my emotional reaction to different phases I was going through in my career, my life, triggered these little moments of me rechecking in with what was authentic and how rigid should I be in all these plans I was making. Sometimes you can get too committed to a path. And if you're changing or, the dynamics around you are changing, it can be a little hard to see what part needs to adjust to go forward for you to get in a better place where what you're doing and what you're feeling are kind of reconciled to, I don't know, just feel most in your balance in what you're doing.
As you went from somebody who's like, I am going to be successful in my career, like I'm going to accomplish these amazing things, and you were doing that, where did that start to shift for you from being a careerist to that, maybe those first couple check-ins to be like, this maybe isn't working for me?
I was making the transition from lower management levels in the organization to senior management levels in the organization. I had a little bit of a belief that meritocracy and my results would speak for themselves as I, strove and continued to advance in the organization. And what I found when I got to a senior management position was there were senior management paths where, if you were trying to reconcile kind of work and career, you reach this kind of pinnacle S curve in your career, and then people would kind of just broaden their scope of working out from there, where they rebalance career and family. And then there were people who continued on the trajectory. And what I noticed, because I wanted to be on this trajectory, right? But what I noticed on this trajectory, once I was kind of in that group of senior management, I could see it behind the curtain, if you will, is these high trajectory people, they were careerists where I was seeing trade-offs that were happening in their personal life. They, particularly for women, they were married but didn't have kids, or they were married and they had children, but they were not as present as I wanted to be for myself. Again, it's all choices, right? But, they were missing school events and milestones because their travel schedule was really intensive. And so as I saw those things, I just started to play back in my mind, I want to strive, but I'm noticing that such and such leader, to get to their position, they relocated a lot and they're in jobs where they travel 300 days out of the year. Now that I see that that's what it is, now that I'm close enough to that level to see what's happening, do I see any examples of people who are trying to work in the way that I'm trying to work, which is that I don't have like a cutoff of I start work, I end work, and then I go on to my personal life. I very much do integrate it. But there are periods where I need a mental window where I'm just focused on one thing. That led to a bit of introspection on, are my expectations of what I want to do in my day-to-day and what do I achieve, are they realistic? Could I carve that? Could I be a pioneer where I don't see examples? How much can I control and change? How much can I influence where I'm working to adapt to what I'm trying to control and change? And where is there just a kind of force greater than all that, where maybe I need to make my own adaptations? So that led to literally me with my intention and my planning. I had to get the thoughts out on paper, and I had to map, what are my career goals, and broaden that of not just define as within the company I was at. 10 years from now, what do I want to have been true of the way that I parented, of the way that I, was a spouse to my partner, in the way that we were able to support each other's careers. And it just dawned on me through that exercise that where I was, what I was doing, and how that organization needed an employer, a leader to, take on an assignment, behave, etc., was just not going to fulfill what I felt was going to be the way that I work toward my next kind of 10-year plan as a leader, as a spouse, as a parent. And so then I made the shifts to, accommodate my husband's dual career needs with an organization that I felt would let me be the parent that I needed to be. And it kind of cycled out from there.
You can hear Jen's thought process in laying out this plan. Okay, I'll do this and then this to get access to a job here, and then I'll achieve this goal or role or level. And while many people lay out these types of goals, they're often for so many different reasons. I want to achieve a certain status, or I want to be the leader in an organization. For Jen, as she laid out her plan, she wanted her moves to secure a certain level of security, stability, certainty, and she wanted to create as many options as possible for her to succeed and achieve her goals. She and I have done some of this reflection together, and we get into the Enneagram and her type later in the episode. But the thing that she says here, you can lay out goals, perfect plans to get us to a certain place, but you never know how you're going to feel when you get there. And we change as humans. So when we lay out something at the age of 18 or 22, it's often totally out of context with where we find ourselves at the age of 30 or 35 or 40. And then we have to recalibrate. Is this what I thought I wanted? Is this still what I want? What factors have changed? And I love how she took us through her thought process of weighing all the options. I want this role, and I want to be this type of mother and partner. The equation doesn't work. And there's no one around who's making the equation work who I can ask for help, or no one around that I can see at least. When we set these goals, I think it's important to ask ourselves not just, what do I want, but why do I want it? Going much deeper than you might hear typically. And then asking the question that she lays out is, how do I want to feel when I get there? Do I want to feel empowered? Do I want to feel free? Do I want to feel safe? If we lay these things out, it's so much easier to identify, this is why I wanted this, and I'm not getting it. And maybe it's time to change something. And that doesn't always mean leaving the job, but maybe making adjustments within it. Okay, let's get back to the conversation. What were some of the trade-offs that you were not willing to make?
I think one of them was putting all business needs first in terms of what commanded my physical time. So I'm a very delegating type of leader. I build up the capability of my team so that we have collectively more bandwidth, because if we take on great challenges and we've got a really strong bench, then, multiple players can come in to achieve something. And I don't have a hierarchical style either when it comes to, going to some spotlight event or some crucible meeting. So I was trying in my own universe with my team that I was managing at the time, where if there was a trip that I felt someone on my team was incredibly capable of leading, because I had, trained them, they were very strong, they had a good relationship with the customer, I would try to send them on the trip. If I had, something going on where I needed to stay home, it was this hierarchical norm of like, no, your title is X and therefore you have to go. And I was just challenging, like, why? Like, this person is perfectly capable. And the assignments that I was looking at in the future, I remember one conversation in particular, my responsibility had grown to a very large amount, partly because I sign up for work, which, is another topic, but I had a huge scope of responsibility that started the year very tumultuous. Half of that scope was not delivering, and my job was to turn that around. And by the end of that year, I had green shoots on everything on my business. Not only that, some of those green shoots were the first green shoots, brands on my portfolio had seen in 8-10 years. And the feedback was, this is phenomenal and you're such high potential and, you're such an asset to this organization. And, as someone who had worked, 2-3x the scope of my peers and delivered results, I asked the question of, if I get another year like this, what's next for me, right? Every year you have these career check-ins just to make sure that, what you want and the company assessment of how you're performing to qualify for what you want. I was asking that question, wanting to make sure that I was doing everything I needed to do so that I was laying that groundwork for what the next level would be, not necessarily the next day, but in, 18 to 24 months time, a pretty reasonable schedule. And the response I got was basically, regardless of how I performed, there were boxes I was going to need to check, roles I was going to need to take, scope I was going to need to take to advance to a next level. And even though qualitatively in my day-to-day, I was already starting to check those boxes, the broader, machine of it all, had a more systematized way and almost like quantitative way of determining whether or not you had checked a box or not. And it was enlightening to me that there was more of an optics game than I understood, less of a meritocracy than I had been trying to push for. And then I realized now again at this different level that there's a little bit of a box checking that would require me to move to places I wasn't necessarily interested in, move to places that weren't compatible with my personal needs. And I actually appreciate the transparency because I didn't waste another, 5 or 10 years where I was. But just those dynamics of, doing kind of all the things you need to be doing and yet still needing to do more, that then starts to come into conflict with your own goals and wishes, recognizing that for what it is, and then determining if you're going to do something about it and then taking action on that. It was a big lesson for me that I'm glad I recognized at the moment and then took action upon.
Did you see those? So the transparency is great. You were delivering amazing results, and yet there were still these kind of barriers put in front of you to get to the next level. Did you see those standards being applied broadly to everybody?
No. And that's where I think my authentic style probably plays a role. So I am the type to give credit to a team before credit to myself. And there tends to be, a contingent in organizations that are hierarchical that kind of master the craft of self-advocacy, delegating what doesn't act as a bright, shiny penny to upper management. There's a game that definitely is played in large organizations where for you to kind of be the signal and the noise of talent, you need to make yourself stand out in a certain way. It was inauthentic to me to grandstand, to take credit for a team's work as my individual effort, to delegate to a team that was already stretched to the hilt, and ask for more and more and more while I do less and less. And I do think that those personal principles of mine did cause me to stand out less in some of those conversations. Like I could very much picture someone else in the organization, versus talking about all the scope that they had done and that they had delivered green shoots across everything. Like you just heard me articulate it, right? It was like I had all of these brands. I grew them all. Someone else might have come and said, I know that part A of my work is what really matters, and I'm just going to talk about that one. And I'm actually okay if some of these other things don't have green shoots. There's an integrity for me to be green on everything I do and focus on all that. And I do think that played a role in kind of where, certain things were rewarded and certain things weren't. I have learned to better advocate for myself. I have become more able to say I in a conversation in my authentic way. Some of how I've had to do that is when there is a crucible project that's maybe high risk, but also high reward if it's achieved, I will take on that risk versus putting my team through that risk. And then when it goes well, then I did it. I took on that risk and I delivered, and I still struggle a little bit of advocacy. I think it's a bit of a journey for me still, but I'm stronger than I was. And part of that was by tapping into mentors, and many mentors, both male and female, would comment frequently that this tends to be also a female problem. And so I also did see a lot of men were advancing. And I don't want to necessarily say that, there was a deserving, not deserving component. I think that there was definitely, though, a self-advocacy component. And again, I'm one of the 16% of women working, married with kids. There's also just a level of balancing and, time sacrifice that, I have disproportionately, that people in kind of my demographic have disproportionately, that I've had to learn over years how to navigate better. Because I took for granted for a while that there was a little bit more parity than there really is in reality.
So this is one of those places where the idea of authenticity can get a little sticky. But I'm not someone who brags about my accomplishments or needs a lot of credit or glory. Like, I just want my work to speak for itself. I think there's definitely a lot of area in between grandstanding or bragging and expecting people to read our minds to know exactly what we're doing and how we're contributing. Where's the space between those two extremes that feels authentic to you? And we get to question here, is this kind of resistance to self-advocacy or self-promoting? Is this my true nature, or is this decades of ingrained expectations and societal norms that tells me, or in Jen's case, tells her, women support others and they don't stand out, and that's shameful? Or maybe you grew up in a family that repeatedly talked about being humble and valued being humble, and that being humble makes you a good person. These things all impact your beliefs around things like self-advocacy. So it's important to sort out what is the true me and what are some maybe old beliefs or things I absorbed along the way and things that I can leave behind. We get into this more later in the episode and how this is really shifting for her and why. It's really hard to imagine a reality when there's no representation of it. And like for you as, a mother of 3, married, being a very important part of the money that your family is bringing in, like not seeing that, it's like, oh, how does that exist? I don't know how to make that work because I don't see it anywhere. And in the same kind of vein, it's like all the people I see advocating for themselves and progressing because of it are doing it by stepping on other people or are doing it by taking credit for their team's work, right? And so like not being able to see it, it's like, okay, I got to figure this out for myself. And that's a process to test and try and, okay, how do I do this in a way that feels good and that kind of thing. So I totally get that. It's like you just had to figure it out for yourself over time. Yeah. So as you were moving from really like this careerist to rebalancing your priorities and figuring out how to make it all work, was your conclusion then that like, I can't make this all work my way here? And that was a catalyst to you moving on, or what did that look like?
Some areas I was able to make work my way. So, one other piece of realization I had, and I would, encourage people I'm a recovering workaholic. I guess I would say I still work incredibly hard, but, in my 20s, I was working 12, 16-hour days sometimes, right? And I know you know this, but, I was working full time and getting an MBA. I was always signing up for so much. And so some of it was a bit of a realization on, I guess you could say it, those buckets of if I need to better and more authentically work my way, what is that? So define it. And I had redefined it in the shift of, 20 something, no kids into married with a household to provide for and career ambitions still yet, to achieve. So under that definition, what was in my control? What could I influence within the organization, my team, the broader company at large, the path that I could carve out for myself, and what wasn't in control? It was just kind of a forest grid or beyond those first 2 buckets. And I was able to better work my way in the things I can control, in that some of my belief that I had to work long hours was a little bit self-defined. I found mentors in the organization who had been able to chunk their work and, place boundaries. And I try to practice some of those elements that they had. While they were able to place boundaries, though, to the point of examples, a lot of the coaching I got were from people who, had a spouse who didn't work or they didn't have kids. So they would place boundaries versus kind of like personal interests. But my next challenge that was less in my control was the dual career with my husband. Again, coming out of grad school, wanting to have his own career. That career was best served in markets that my company literally had almost no roles in, or if it had roles, didn't necessarily have a clear path to what could come after that would, continue my advancement. And so I did have conversations with the company about, these long-term dual career plan goals that I had. And there was a willingness to accommodate the dual career needs, but there was also messaging about, I was going to start to not check as many boxes quickly. So I don't know. I ultimately had to face the reality that to support what my family needed market wise, I wasn't going to be able to control it all through where I was at the time. And so that was ultimately the final decision factor in my going to, another opportunity that better teed myself and my husband up for our own career ambitions.
When you're assessing, okay, can I succeed here and be authentic? I think it's important to get honest about what you can control and what is part of the culture or the design of an organization. And that can be different than what one particular manager or teammate believes or the way that they act. But what's actually part of the fabric of this company that probably isn't going to change? Jen had this belief that, okay, if you take on more work, you deliver it with excellence, you stay humble, you keep your head down, you'll be noticed and rewarded. And what she learned was that wasn't the way that the system worked in this company, and that there would be things that she needed to do in order to take on those new higher roles that would impact, like this domino effect, all the other things in her life that she was trying to keep standing. I say this, and in the same breath, I also say that we often have a lot more leeway to ask for things than we think that we do. And we talk about this in the next episode, where it's a special episode about leaving your job. In Jen's case, she had really driven to a place of clarity and transparency on what they or the company needed from her, and they weren't things she felt she wanted to do or could do. And ultimately, that's what led to her decision to leave. So we talked a bit about this process of you developing your own style of self-advocacy in a way that works for you. I'm curious, were there other things that you got feedback along the way or that you felt like you had to develop that you had to kind of navigate this process of figuring out how to do it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I mentioned, life stage, I think, creates these crucible check-ins on your authenticity. But for that first decade of my career, and even to an extent today, no matter what organization I'm in, who I'm working with, the feedback that's been most consistent in my career has been that I'm very cerebral, in that, it's kind of like that Myers-Briggs dynamic of intuition versus judgment and thinking and feeling. I'm a heavy intellectualizer of things, and it doesn't mean I'm not empathetic, but it means that in business situations, I was kind of the one in the room doing the game theory trees in my head. And when we were working on solutions, the conversation in the room was about scenario A and B. And I was thinking about C, D, E, and F. And, I found that F was the best idea, and, would try to bring groups along with that. And I realized that my most innate sense of thinking and processing, and then my style of communicating what was in my head, was not typical for the organization that I was working with. And when I would get that feedback, my reaction, not to be dismissive, but I would think to myself, I don't know how to be any other way. Like I would hear so consistently, that it's very obvious to others that I am thinking of a bigger picture in my head, but then I need to guide them along the journey of when I'm trying to translate that for a group, and particularly when I'm trying to sell them an idea and get them to adopt that idea. So I understood what the feedback was. I didn't understand how to adapt to it because I didn't know how to be any other way. And so I find that everything I do starts with a little bit of, trying to get anecdotes and gather anecdotes. So I would talk to mentors, to understand more, or just people who worked with me, like, this is the feedback I've gotten. This is what I feel like is natural to me. Do you see me doing anything where you think that I could reconcile these two things? I wasn't necessarily trying to completely change who I was, but I was trying to understand how I could adapt it in a way where people would understand why I was the way I was, and hopefully over time embrace it as a strength, right? So through being able to hear the feedback, but also a little bit trying to stay true to myself, knowing this was something that's a fundamental part of me. I've always been this way. Being open to seeing myself through other people's eyes and understanding how I can have common understanding between without changing who I was. So what I was able to learn, fortunately, through that kind of whole exercise was that there were communication hacks that I could do to help people understand me better and then understand my behaviors better when I was in certain situations. So when I was meeting a new team and the getting to know you, I would always start to bring in elements like communication style, problem solving style, where I would have then the platform up front to say, I've heard the feedback before and I'm very aware of the fact that I tend to do this and I tend to do that. So you will see me do this and do that. And I'm always open, if something is not clear in what I'm conveying, or there's more that we need to discuss to drive that mutual understanding, know that I am always happy to drive it, but this tends to be my style, right? And then I would in kind say, what is your style? And I found that just kind of sharing up front, this is how I am. This is then how you'll see me work, how you'll see me think and respond to things. And in kind, showing that I want to understand that for someone else, because I intend to adapt where I can, but in other ways, I am who I am, that I found that behavior was reciprocated in time. And so over time, I think people understand me quicker. I think I can work with people more effectively faster. And the feedback still, will come, but it's evolved over time as something I need to fix to something that people are just observing, about me. And that to me is a big win. But I think it was important that I, understood what could change and not, again, but that equally for what could change, what could I expect people to change versus what would I need to change? And that helped me a tremendous amount. I will say one thing that I feel everyone should do, and I'm a little bit of your kind of disciple on this, is, Enneagram. I wish I had the benefit of an Enneagram when I was 25 instead of, I was kind of probably in my early 30s when I did my first Enneagram exercise with my organization. That was hugely eye-opening. I am a 6, and everyone I worked with at the time I did the exercise was a 3 or a 7 or an 8. It explains so much about one, why feedback is so consistent, and then 2, why I was getting this feedback that it was fundamentally different, right? It's because I am fundamentally different. So Enneagram, I would say, is the navigation tool for self-understanding and then working with others that I think has been very game-changing on me, also working my way in a new organization I come across faster. Like I'll introduce myself in addition to those 2 areas I mentioned before, communication, problem solving. I add in, I'm an Enneagram 6 and this means this. And that's really helped to understand, that there are differences that can exist and then how different you are. If I was a 6 in a world of, 3s and 7s and 8s and 6s, my adaptation to work in my way might have looked a little different because there were more examples like me. But this was literally in a room of 22 people. I was the only 6. And then I did the test again 5 years later with a different team. And yet again, I was the only person in the room who was a 6. So understanding that authenticity within yourself that sets you apart, and then how much is it setting yourself apart, can be a really great insight to help you figure out how much you need to adapt or how much you need to have people understand where you're coming from so you can work with them more authentically and successfully.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, thanks for the plug. And I think that is so important. Like what you said around, it's really like giving people the context and communicating those differences. You were setting expectations with people so that they could understand, oh, this is the way that Jen thinks. Like we're evaluating 3 scenarios. She's already evaluated 10. And there might be something totally different that we haven't even thought of. And like, let's make space for that and not see it as a challenge to our ideas, or what page is Jen on? We're all over here. You know, there's like all those judgments that happen in the moment, or misunderstandings or miscommunications that can happen in the moments where people are on 2 different pages, right? So it's like, oh, I know that you're on that page. I know that you're on that page. And how do we bring that together? I think is so valuable. And there's really not enough of that going on. Obviously, I mean, great. This is why I do what I do, but it's the recognition of the differences and the communication of the differences. And that's really all that needs to happen so that you skip over all that other stuff, you doubting yourself or people questioning you or solutions not coming to fruition because you all just can't see eye to eye. So I love that. Okay, so I want to provide a little bit of context here. And I've talked about Enneagram before, but for anyone new to it, it's a framework for how we show up as humans and how we can recognize the underlying motivations behind our actions. It's sometimes grouped in with a myriad of personality assessments that are out there, but for me, it's a much deeper tool because of the motivation piece of it. Oftentimes in the corporate world, we see a lot of type 3s and type 8s. Type 3 is the achiever. They're all about driving towards goals and accomplishments, and they really desire approval or admiration or to kind of maintain a certain image. Type 8 is the challenger. They're strong, direct, and they really desire control or autonomy. And these types are natural kind of take charge types. They're often the first and the loudest to speak up. And they often make up a disproportionate amount of the leadership level in companies, or at least that's the case from my experience, because they fit the standards and the norms best. And this is where misunderstandings and conflict can happen, because when there's a dominant style in a workplace, and there certainly is in the American corporate workplace around these kind of like more assertive types, more quick to action, that tends to then be the norm, and that then becomes what's valued. So when there's that dominant style, naturally groups have a tendency to see the outlier as wrong or not as good. That person doesn't speak up immediately, or they don't have something to say, or maybe we think that they're not as strong of a leader because they didn't speak up right away. And instead of saying that, we could say, oh, they're going to bring more data into the solution, or they're weighing out more scenarios to find the best way forward. So they don't have to answer immediately. But when they do, it's going to be so much better. The latter isn't happening quite as much. And so this is truly the focus of the work that I do with teams. It's understanding each other's way of working and finding ways to be more effective together. How could we see Jen's style, which is a type 6, more security oriented, which makes her a great scenario planner and problem solver, but also sometimes comes across as negative or always calling out issues or problems? How can we make that an asset to a company and not a challenge? Or taking someone who's naturally really harmony oriented and values drive-in common understanding and solutions that work for everyone in some way. This is the type 9. Instead of seeing them as indecisive or a weak leader because they won't take a stand right away, how can we see them as someone who is excellent at integrating lots of different perspectives and actually use that to drive better outcomes? Okay, I'm done with my rant. If you can't tell, I'm really passionate about this stuff. But this is really important that we tend to kind of merge into one way of doing things as the right way. And when we can take a step back, we can really recognize where different approaches to work are going to build better solutions. All right, back to the conversation. I want to fast forward a little bit to where you are today. And you're the chief brand officer at Japonesque. You're doing some pretty innovative and disruptive things in the beauty and wellness space. So for someone who, as an Enneagram 6, can be risk averse or security oriented, you took this huge leap into a company that is in really early growth or not in quick growth stages, less stable clearly than a Fortune 50. How did you muster up the courage to take this big leap?
Yeah, it was a leap. I think I surprised a lot of my friends, actually.
Yeah, maybe a little bit.
Yeah. So Japonesque is a very, relative to my past worlds of working, these Fortune 50, FTSE 100 type juggernauts. It's definitely small in that context, but it's incredibly dynamic. So the company has 3 brands, all disrupting their respective category spaces. So we have Japonesque, which is the fastest growing tool brands in the US, top 3 share in the beauty tool space. Makeup Racer, which pioneered sustainability in the makeup removal category. And Barefoot Scientist, which is a younger upstart brand, but really working to redefine foot care in a wellness context. Much like we've seen so much disruption in other parts of, personal care in a wellness mindset. That description is what initially hooked me into the organization, because it took all of the things that I loved about my past jobs. I love building things. I love fixing things. I love the redemption arc of, started with a 10% decline when I took it and grew it, to growth. Or, started as a little seed of an idea and we turned it into an X million dollar business. So the fundamental proposition of it was there. I think it was the fact that it is its own, entity. It's a private equity owned company, which means on the one hand, there's a lot of mentality to, invest for growth and drive scale. So you have the wind in your sails of, a board that's extremely supportive, you trying, bigger, bolder things to drive growth. But on the other hand, if you take the wrong move and you feel it's very exposed and volatile for the organization. There's a lot of burden of, at my level as an officer in the company too, the choices we make affect the whole organization versus, a risk that you calculate as best you can, but ultimately ends up being a risk in a very large organization. It's a dent, but it's like a paper cut, right? So that definitely weighed on me as, whoa, this is something different. The work is fundamentally challenging, but the implications of success and failure is vastly different. And since we just mentioned Enneagram, me being a 6, liking security and plans and future, it definitely gave me pause. But what ultimately really took me into it was the broader profile of the CEO that I'd be working with, the board that I'd be working with, the ambition of the company, the purpose of the brands was all in line with what I had defined as the authentic way I wanted to work going forward. So I have, for one, our private equity firm, the leaders of that firm have been on record saying that they almost go out of their way to look for female founded brands to bring into company portfolios because they believe so much in the power of business women in the CPG space. And so and with that, I have felt a lot of support in that little, demographic that I'm in as, an ambitious career woman juggling family and children, but wanting to drive impact and have a large amount of responsibility. Their fundamental value system supports what I want to balance in my life. And in the conversations about, whether to go to this company, that was a huge driver. I was still in a phase juggling needs with my husband, just in figuring out if I was going to be able to reconcile my personal needs as a professional. They were highly engaged in that conversation, very transparent, and I found very true to everything that they said. So that was a big benefit, just that mentality of the leaders that I would be working with. And then in my style, like we just talked about with the way that I've grown a habit of saying, this is who I am, this is how I communicate, this is how I problem solve. In the conversations about, was it a mutual fit for me to join the company? I talk through all those things. This is my style. This is, based on what you're telling me are the company's challenges. This is the type of way that I would look to tackle those things. And, I want to make sure that this is a fit. Are you comfortable with what I'm saying my approach is going to be? And are you comfortable with what I'm saying is important to me in a business context? I also had very upfront conversations about my career ambitions. And I think in all that way, just having the right upfront conversation, not in a stubborn, like, this is who I am and it's not changing, but like, this is who I am. This is how I work. This is why I think it's a value, but I want to make sure you think it's a value too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I learned that by setting that tone in the conversation, it really helped me feel good about coming into this company. And I've been there a little less than 2 years now, but I absolutely love it. It's everything I loved in my past roles, still with a lot of values I enjoyed from prior companies I worked with. I left my companies, the past companies I worked for, still with high opinions of those companies. I learned a ton. I met great leaders, and it was nice to know that some of those things that I, worried I would miss most, I still get in this role, but now with a little bit more of a level set where I feel very much on the same page with the values and the understanding of ways of working with the board, the officers in the company, and even the broader organization culture. When I did my Here's Who I Am to my own team, I took that same exercise, but in the inverse, right? Here's who I am. Here's how I work. I'd love to know, who you are and how you work. And it's just been a great high EQ environment, high inclusive environment in terms of working styles and working perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how has that enabled you to show up as the leader that you want to be? What does your leadership style look like now, and how have you been able to really step into that?
I'm a very servant leader. Probably it's from my P&G upbringing, which had that as, a big slogan as you came in as a new hire. And by that, I mean, I'm not leading for my own satisfaction. I'm leading under a broader mission for the company, and I am leading to develop and grow my team for the sake of, they're being able to execute the business, but also they're being able to develop their own careers. I have a very, broad range of people in my organization, but I have a very ambitious contingent where I can see myself, back in my 20s wanting the same coaching. And as a smaller organization, when they look for mentors, they have it's a flatter structure. So they have a smaller bench of who to go to. And so I really try to make myself be as available to those individuals as much as I can within the walls of our company. I, from day one, set those, personal boundaries. I am East Coast based. My company is West Coast based. That was another upfront conversation to say, the only way I can make this work is with some core hours. I'm not going to regularly be available to have a meeting at 8 p.m. Eastern at the end of a Pacific day. And what that actually led to was me authentically working out guardrails that ended up being more productive than I've ever had in my career, frankly. I've gotten smarter about chunking work, zoning meetings with, people in this geography versus that geography, where I'm not working both an East Coast and Pacific Coast day. That's been a big personal win for me, because my past self would have wanted the guardrails, but felt this need to accommodate others and kind of adapt myself 100% into their schedule. And I've learned over time to build the habit of the meeting halfway. And they in turn, are never disrupted by me on East Coast, time, before they even get into the office. I don't want them to be inundated with 10 emails that came across at 5 a.m. their time. So It's a two-way street, I've learned, but I've been able to kind of set those principles better up front coming to the organization new.
So as we wrap up here, I'm curious, what's next for you as you navigate work and life?
Well, I'm done with kids. So just the three that we have.
Done having them, not raising them, but yeah.
I mean, I still have ambitions in my own career. I'd love to be the leader of a company someday. So the work that I try to do is not just, loving the work in and of itself, but having the work stretch me and push me so that my skill set's more broader for things. I guess I'm still always planning for having the most opportunities available based on, what I do in the near term. This company's been great for that because with fewer layers, the buck stops with me on more things. And yeah, I mean, hopefully I'll keep the C to my title and get the CEO spot someday. That's definitely an ambition I have. But in the near term, I'm just enjoying the work I'm doing and focused on the learning and the skill building that I need to do so that, I can meet that moment when I see it coming my way. And then I guess the last thing is, like having this conversation today and the journey I've been on realizing that there aren't a lot of examples that I had grown up in my career seeing, just trying to put myself out there as an example for others to learn from, good and bad. I didn't make every move correctly or timely. Some I did, but I think sharing it for all that it is so that those with similar challenges behind me can have a faster learning curve. I've been focused on that both professionally in my work environment, as I mentioned, and then, kind of outside of work hours, just offering that perspective to others.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great note to end on. How can we share our stories and the things that we've learned and the ways that we've grown along the way to help other people that are navigating similar challenges or might find something insightful from that. And that is exactly why I started this podcast. So thank you so much for being on, for sharing your own journey. And I'm excited to see where you go.
Who knows? Yeah, but I love being on and the conversations that you're sparking are really meaningful. And I'm very excited that the current generation of, people navigating the careers have the benefit of content like this. I think we could have benefited from it in many times in our past. So it's great to have this forum.
Okay. So as we wrap up this conversation, we talked a lot about recalibrating life and career goals as our circumstances change. And this is not only about changes like getting married or having kids. As you change and evolve as a human, your values change, your energy changes, your goals are inherently going to change with some of that. So as you're assessing your goals, I would encourage you to say, what do I want and why do I want it? What am I going to get when I get there? What's the why behind the goal? Is it power? Is it status? All these extrinsic things, these external things can often be our why. But there could be internal whys that are important for you to explore and evaluate. And then next, I would say, how do I want to feel when I get there? When I get to this point, what is that going to do for me in terms of how I show up, what I'm feeling? And then the last question that I would ask is, what will it enable me to do or not do? Maybe there's some insight in that for you in the sense of, I want this job so I make more money. And that money will liberate me from some of these burdens or responsibilities, or will enable me to hire someone to clean my house, as an example. And that will free up my time so that I can do other things that are important to me. And so sometimes those external, extrinsic things will lead to a deeper internal thing, but it's really important to really flush that out and think through that. So just going back through the questions one more time. What do I want? Why do I want it? How do I want to feel when I get there? And what will it enable me to do or not do? In the episode, we also talked about interviewing and knowing how you work best and incorporating that fully into the process of looking for a new job. I think if more of us could articulate, hey, this is my work style and it allows me to contribute and deliver XYZ, how does that land with the way that the company gets work done? I think we could better assess which companies will leverage that and which ones might not be a great fit. This knowing yourself really well can be done in so many ways. Enneagram is just one of them. But if you want to learn more about that particular framework, we'll put some resources in the show notes. And then last, we talked about how to decide when the math just isn't mathing, when to leave a company because certain things are outside of your control. Next week, we have a special episode coming up that's all about quitting your job. So that's going to be an amazing resource if you're in this position or if you're considering it. It's all about how to decide if you should quit a job. What are the questions to ask yourself and how to assess the situation? So hopefully that will feel like a great set of information or some reflections or some things to consider.